The world changes silently and without fanfare on a particular summer day in 1947. A goat belonging to a Bedouin flock wanders off among the multiple caves that dot the desert hillsides. Young Muhammad ad-Dib is a Bedouin lad responsible for tending these goats. And it should come as no surprise that he becomes more than a little agitated over the fate of this lost animal. He runs off to search among the rocky crags of the Judean wilderness. After a time, he begins hurling stones into the cave entrances, hoping to frighten any wayward beast out into the open. Suddenly, young Muhammad lets loose a stone that produces another sound, the sound of shattering earthenware. The stone has broken open a large clay vessel nestled along the cave wall. The Bedouin lad pulls himself up the cliff and peers into the cave entrance. He spots several tall earthen jars with broken pottery fragments laying all about. His first thought is that this might be the lair of ghosts and desert demons. He darts away from the cave, returning to his Bedouin camp. The next day, Muhammad and a friend go back to the cave. Summoning their courage, they make their way through the small opening and begin opening the jars, only to find that most are empty. But in one, their eyes are met by several odd-looking bundles of flaxen-covered, rolled, leathery vellum parchments. Heading back to their tents, they unroll their dubious find, noticing some unusual writing which they can't read, covering the inner surface of the vellum. Puzzled, they decide to carry the bundles around with them for a number of days. During the weeks that follow, the scrolls are kept in a bag, dangling from a tent pole. Finally, the decision is made to take them to the open market, the souk, as it's called in Arabic, in Bethlehem, where they are brought to a local shopkeeper nicknamed Kando, who runs a small general store and cobbler shop.
I bought several of the parchments, but my native tongue is Arabic, and I couldn't read the letters, which were in fact Hebrew. For a while, I wondered whether the leathery vellum might be cut into strips and used in making sandal straps. But on examining the letters again, I decided that they just might be worth something. So, an accomplice and I returned to the cave where Muhammad had found the scrolls and began searching through other caves in the vicinity. Indeed, we discovered several other jumbled wads of vellum, which we now recognized as scrolls. Next, I decided to take 4 of my scrolls to the old city of Jerusalem to show them to the Christian elders of the Syrian Orthodox Church, to which I belonged. My destination was St. Mark's Monastery, in the Armenian quarter of the city.
The head of the monastery, the Archbishop Samuel, is a Syrian Orthodox cleric who looks almost regal. I was clearly intrigued by the strange documents, but I was equally unable to read the Hebrew letters. My hunch was that the writing might be ancient Syriac. In any case, I eagerly bought them for the sum of 24 Jordanian pounds. That's about $100. In the meantime, Kando visits an antiquities dealer of Turkish-Armenian ancestry, whose shop is located in the crooked streets of Jerusalem's old city. Kando sells him a few more of his parchment fragments. The following day, November 23rd, 1947, the Armenian phones the famed archaeologist of the Hebrew University, E.L. Sukenik, and arranges a secret meeting on the following morning. At the barbed wire that divides Arab East Jerusalem from Jewish West Jerusalem, Incredibly, this Hebrew-speaking modern Israeli can actually read and understand the ancient Hebrew writing with little difficulty. Gazing for the first time at a single scrap of parchment, he's amazed. On November 25th, 1947, he writes in his journal, "Today I met the antiquities dealer. A Hebrew book has been discovered in a jar. He showed me a fragment written on parchment." Sukenik decides that he needs to see more of these parchments, and he wants to go right to the source, Kondo's shop in Bethlehem. There's only one problem. Bethlehem is located in Arab territory, in what will later become part of the Kingdom of Jordan, while Sukenik lives in Jewish Jerusalem, in what is, in a matter of months, to be reborn amidst war and bloodshed as the new capital of the State of Israel. Travel between the two areas is risky, but Sukenik finds it necessary to make the clandestine journey. What Sukenik discovers in Kondo's shop far exceeds his expectations. His journal entry that day declares, "I saw 4 pieces of leather with Hebrew writing. The script seems ancient to me. Is it possible? He says there are also jars. I looked a bit and found good biblical Hebrew, a text unknown to me. He says a Bedouin of the Ta'amiri tribe brought it to him." He later wrote, "It may be that this is one of the greatest finds ever made in Palestine, a find we never so much as hoped for." Kondo relinquishes 3 of his scrolls that he hasn't sold to the Archbishop Samuel to Professor Sukenik, who quickly becomes aware of the astonishing documents. He has acquired a partial text of the book of Isaiah, written by the hand of a Jewish scribe 2 centuries before the Common Era. Secondly, a collection of non-biblical psalms, which look like biblical psalms, but which had never been seen by modern eyes until 1947. And a strange document describing an apocalyptic battle, the so-called War Scroll. Sukenik writes, "My hands shook as I started to unwrap one of them. I read a few sentences. It was written in beautiful biblical Hebrew. The language was like that of the Psalms, but the text was unknown to me. I looked and looked, and I suddenly had the feeling that I was privileged by destiny to gaze upon a Hebrew scroll which had not been read for more than 2,000 years." An incredible footnote of history is the fact that on that very evening, November 29th, 1947, the United Nations is voting for the creation of the State of Israel. Sukenik's journal entry reads, "While I was examining these precious documents in my study, the late news on the radio announced that the United Nations would be voting on the resolution that night whether or not Israel would be allowed to become a nation. My youngest son, Mati, was in the next room twiddling radio knobs in an effort to get New York. It was past midnight when the voting was announced. I was so engrossed in a particularly absorbing passage in one of the scrolls when my son rushed in with the shout that the vote on the Jewish state had passed. This great event in Jewish history was thus combined in my home in Jerusalem with another event, no less historic, the one political, the other cultural." Nevertheless, Kondo doesn't relinquish all the scrolls in his possession. There are several large scroll fragments he is unwilling to part with. Yet he fears that he will be held responsible for removing antiquities from a historical site, a crime punishable under both Jordanian and Israeli law. For his own protection, he decides to bury these large parchment fragments in his own garden. But when he later digs up the spot to retrieve them, he finds instead just a tarry, mangled mess. We can only speculate on what those parchments might have contained. Back in Jerusalem at the end of January 1948, the Archbishop Samuel has his personal emissary write a letter to, of all people, E.L. Sukenik, asking his judgment on some old parchments and making a fictitious offer to sell them. They arranged to meet in the Arab sector of Jerusalem, which is still divided by political turmoil. Sukenik uses the occasion to borrow 4 mysterious documents, which he now takes home to examine. These parchments, it seems, are even more valuable than his other 3. Identifies their contents. Another scroll of the book of Isaiah, some 24 feet in length and virtually entire and complete, containing all 66 chapters. A previously unknown commentary on the small and often overlooked biblical prophet Habakkuk, or Habakkuk, unknown until this year, 1948. A manual of rules for membership in an exclusive Jewish religious order, most likely the order which wrote the scrolls, and a clever reworking of the book of Genesis, the so-called Genesis Apocryphon, containing many previously unknown expansions on the biblical account. Of course, Sukenik eagerly offers to buy them, but when they meet again, the emissary merely takes them back, refusing to sell and offering no explanation. Undaunted, Professor Sukenik now sets to work transcribing and editing the 3 scrolls remaining in his possession. He publishes the first of the documents between 1948 and 1950. But the scrolls aren't instantly heralded as a major find. Many in the academic community, such as the famous scholar Solomon Zeitlin, don't believe that the scrolls are authentic. The charge is medieval forgeries. Documents that old simply don't survive for 2,000 years in caves. They must be forgeries. But others are convinced that these do in fact date from the days of ancient Judea in the first 2 centuries BCE. The Hebrew letters are similar to those found on tombs and other stone monuments from the same period. Eventually, the scrolls are subjected to radiocarbon-14 dating. But since an unacceptably large amount of scroll material would have to be destroyed in this testing, the decision is made to test the scroll covers, the flaxen material enshrouding the parchments themselves, which the Bedouin had pulled away to reveal their treasure. The tests are conducted by a scholar from the University of Chicago, who establishes that the material is fully 2 millennia old. The date arrived at for the flax is 33 of the Common Era, plus or minus 200 years. In other words, the scroll covers may date from as early as 168 BCE and no later than 233 CE. Of course, the scrolls themselves might be even older than the flaxen covers meant to protect them. And with the compelling evidence of handwriting analysis, most scholars have come to favor the earlier part of this time frame as the likely period of composition, the 2nd century BCE. But in the meantime, the Archbishop has other plans for his treasures. Samuel now brings his 4 scrolls to the United States amidst great fanfare and a special ceremony in the Library of Congress. Rumor has it that he hopes to sell them for a reported sum of at least $1 million. Samuel's asking price is well beyond the reach of even the most serious investors. 5 years of frustration follow, and Samuel finally decides to run a blind ad in the June 1st, 1954 Wall Street Journal. It reads, "Miscellaneous for sale, the 4 Dead Sea Scrolls, biblical manuscripts dating back to at least 200 BC are for sale, and this would be an ideal gift to an educational or religious institution by an individual or group. Box F 206, The Wall Street Journal." Quite by coincidence, E.L. Sukenik's adopted son, Yigael Yadin, an archaeologist and Israeli political figure in his own right, happens to be in America at the time. One day, he receives a call from a friend who has noticed this unusual ad in the Wall Street Journal. Could it be that these are the very scrolls his father had hoped to buy years earlier from the Archbishop's emissary? Convinced that this is the case, he proceeds to negotiate for the purchase of the scrolls through a bank acting as a neutral broker. In this way, Yadin manages to acquire, for a sum of $250,000, all 4 scrolls on behalf of the State of Israel. A total of 7 Dead Sea Scrolls are now in possession of the Jewish state. They're so highly valued that a special museum is constructed specifically to house them, the Shrine of the Book. For quite some time, it's thought that there are no more scrolls to be found in the wilderness of Judea. But with the discovery by the Bedouin of additional manuscript finds, there begins a virtual race to scour each and every cave up and down the shores of the Dead Sea in a Middle Eastern version of the great California gold rush. The only real question is, who will get there first, the archaeologists or the Bedouin? In 1949, the archaeologists make their own concerted effort, an expedition organized by Father Roland Deveau and Gerald Harding of the Jordanian Department of Antiquities. There are also expeditions from the prestigious École Biblique, the Palestinian Archaeological Museum, and the American School of Oriental Research. The caves are numbered according to the chronology of their discovery. In Cave 3, a most curious artifact is found, unlike all the others, which have been written on dried animal skins. This item consists of 2 broken rolls of pure copper, so oxidized that the archaeologists are unable to open it. Unlike the other scrolls of parchment or animal hide, this broken scroll was literally pounded into sheets of copper. And it oxidized over the centuries. It had gone brittle. It cannot be opened. It has to be sawn into little arcs, which are laid one next to another. Some of the letters are inadvertently sawn through, but it couldn't be helped. When it's all laid out in the open, the scholars proceed to transcribe and translate it. It turns out to be an inventory of buried treasure, more than 200 tons of gold, silver, and perhaps consecrated items from the sacred temple, along with precise locations as to where this treasure was buried in the city of Jerusalem and the wilderness of Judea. An expedition is even launched to go out into the desert with metal detectors. But to date, not a trace of the treasure has ever come to light. Then there's Cave 11, which contains some of the best preserved scrolls, including the longest of the documents. It's a detailed description of an enormous temple to stand on Jerusalem's Mount Moriah at the end of time. The Temple Scroll. There's also Cave number 4, found by the Bedouin, which holds tens of thousands of fragments from over 500 different documents. Some of the most important of these include a letter, apparently written by the founder of the ancient sect that lived here, and fragments of another rule book for the sect called the Damascus Rule, as well as assorted ancient prayers and blessings, and previously unknown unread commentaries on the biblical books of Isaiah, Psalms, Hosea, Nahum, and Habakkuk. Were they the so-called Essene sect, or a radical group of Zadokite priests, or some sort of proto-Christian group, or some other group entirely? Was there some sort of link between the ideas expressed in the scrolls and ancient Jewish Christianity? And what about the fact that the scrolls came to light exactly at the time when the modern state of Israel was born? Is it fair to use them as evidence to bolster Jewish claims on the land? According to other theories, the scrolls had actually been smuggled out of Jerusalem prior to it being besieged by the Romans during the Great Revolt of 66 to 70 CE. Might the scrolls in that case represent a connection between the ancient Jewish drive for independence and the modern quest for a Jewish state? Understandably, things began to get emotional.